Hi, everybody. My name is Grace Chung, and welcome to our lunch colloquium series. And it's great to see everybody. Today we have Dr. Geoff Boeing, who's here from USC's Sol Price School of Public Policy. We're really excited to have him here from LA speaking with us. And how this will go is today, Geoff will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll have some time afterwards for Q&A. So feel free to put questions in the chat area throughout, and then we'll leave time afterwards to answer your questions. So I'll hand it over now to Luis to say a few more words.
Thank you, Grace. So welcome, everybody. I'm Luis Betancourt. I'm the director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. I want to welcome you to our lunchtime colloquium. So today, as you heard, and as you know, we'll have Geoff Boeing, who's an assistant professor at the Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis department of USC. It's a department that has exactly the right name for him. So I'll introduce him in a moment. But I want to tell you that Geoff was actually, as the Mansueto Institute was starting about 3.5 years ago, Geoff was our first speaker. He came by and gave a wonderful talk about his methods of spatial analysis. He'll elaborate on those today. I'll say a few words in a moment. But so Geoff is a very special guest and friend of our community in Chicago. So I'm very happy to have you with us again, Geoff, and hear all about your So Geoff, in my mind, is very much sort of the new generation of urban planning and urban planners, kind of thinking about the spatial environment, but also of social and environmental conditions in the built environment and in society in new ways. And he's really pioneered the way of bringing together sort of the most extraordinary resources from data and geospatial analysis and so forth into the process of planning and understanding cities and urban development. So he's done a lot of work to enable us all to work better through his software package, OSMNX. I think we all do better work because of you, Geoff. And he'll tell us a little bit about how he himself is using, sort of the master is using the tool to continue to analyze the evolution of urban fabric today, I think. That'll be one of the themes. But also he's been doing wonderful work about housing and rental markets in particular, and how those are being affected by technology, and also how other features of cities and transportation and carbon and so forth are changing because of changes in the built environment, and how that also can be measured in different ways. So without further ado, Geoff, it's a great pleasure to have you with us again, and we look forward to hearing you talk. Take it away.
Thanks, Luis. I appreciate the kind words. And thanks, Grace, for getting everything organized for us. I'm happy to be back at the University of Chicago. I'm bummed that it's remote this time. The weather's probably a little bit better in LA, though. We're 75 and sunny every single day. I don't know if that's the right time of year for Chicago. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see this okay? So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about my recent work doing street network modeling and analysis. In particular, today I want to talk about the portion of my research that emphasizes open science, reproducibility, and replicability, and some of the efforts I've been trying to make in that space in the street network morphology research trajectory. So I'm going to briefly introduce this motivation of why we would analyze street networks in the first place. So what is their role in the city? How do they shape urban living? Then I will briefly talk about some new tools. I call them new, but I realized a couple of days ago, OSMNX is 4 years old now. It's the same age as Trump's presidency. So maybe it's not so new, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the methods that I use to model and analyze street networks. And then we'll look at some empirical stuff. So a couple of recent projects creating models and indicators, and then some results coming out of that. So one portion of that will be looking at some time trends in American urban form and how it's changed, especially in recent decades. And then secondly, some work in progress I'm doing right now, looking at cross-sectional analyses around the world. I'm going to try to create models and indicators of street networks from OpenStreetmap data worldwide. So first off, to set this whole project up, I'd like to think for a minute about why we study street networks in the context of travel behavior or urban equity, social justice. So street networks and other urban transportation networks provide a sort of substrate and connective tissue for the city. They organize a city's human dynamics. And here we can see 4 different city street networks all held at the same scale of 1 square mile. And holding them at that consistent spatial scale lets us see the pattern, and texture, and grain of the circulation network. It shows us how they reflect different transportation technologies, design paradigms, eras of urbanization, different political contexts, expressions of power in different places, the underlying terrain, local culture, and different economic conditions. For example, consider the different histories and values that are embedded in the classic street grid, from Hippodamus's early urban design work in ancient Greece, to the Law of the Indies, to the US Homestead Act and New York Commissioner's Plan. The grid has been used for centuries to express a certain human order over the landscape, or to organize transportation around spaces of power and control, or to make land more amenable to real estate speculation and development. Alternatively, consider Haussmann's reorganization of Paris and its planning goals, or the autocentric form of different US Sunbelt cities, and the notions of lifestyle, aspiration, privilege, and exclusion that are very deliberately planned through street networks into different kinds of cities and suburbs around the world. Now, all of these street networks demonstrate different levels of connectedness or accessibility, compactness, resilience, and sustainability. If we start adding in stuff like building footprints and other aspects of the urban fabric, like land parcels or demographics, we can start thinking about household access to jobs or to schools and stores, what that access looks like for different kinds of communities as a function of race or class, education, wealth, etc. We can see how the urban form was very deliberately designed to separate different kinds of people, or how it provides access for certain kinds of people differently than for others. And especially the vast gulf between urban fabric in the core of large American cities, like you see in the top with New York and San Francisco, versus a much more self-organized fabric of informal settlements in the global south, like in the bottom here in Monrovia and Port-au-Prince, where the formal circulation network in white very barely even permeates into these informal settlements. This is something that Luis has done a lot of research in. But across all of these different examples, transportation planning has restructured urban networks over time. As cities have evolved, planning in one form or another has worked through transportation technologies and new paradigms to restructure the shape and function of cities. Now, transportation planners have studied street networks for decades, but today we can evaluate these outcomes with new data, new tools, new methods coming out of statistical physics to better understand the structure and resilience of networks, and most importantly, through new methods of computation. So this shows some of that evolution over time in the US. These are typical street networks from different decades in America. On the far left, we have the sort of imperfect but interconnected grid that was very common at the turn of the 20th century. By the 1940s, we can start to see the broad reorganization of American cities around the logic of the automobile, streets that were designed first to be driven on and only second for other transportation modes. And then culminating in the 1990s with this disconnected fabric of cul-de-sacs and T-intersections, very coarse-grained intersection density. And I say culminated in the 1990s, and I'll come back to that idea in just a few minutes. But first, I want to talk about how we can model these things and think about some of these trends. So I created a software tool called OSMNX. The acronym stands for OpenStreetmap Plus X. And it's a Python package to let us easily download, model, and analyze street networks. If you're not familiar with it, OpenStreetmap is a worldwide global mapping platform and database for geospatial stuff. And we'll look at some of that stuff is in just a moment. Network X is a network analysis library that was developed at Los Alamos National Lab. So OSMNX kind of serves as glue to connect these two things together, and it integrates with other Python libraries like GeoPandas or iGraph as well. But we can use OSMNX to automatically, in a single command, download and model the street network for any geography in the world, either a bounding box or a point and some distance around it. You can pass in addresses, place names, anything in OpenStreetMap's database. Once it does that, it algorithmically corrects and processes the network topology. Now that's important because of how OpenStreetMap represents nodes and edges, the components of a network model. The nodes on OpenStreetMap are just points in space. So while you're digitizing, you'll get lots and lots of points along a street. We don't want those to be nodes. Typically, when we think about a network in urban planning or transport geography, we think about the nodes as intersections and dead ends, and the edges are the street segments that link them. So that's what OSMNX does under the hood to create these models for us. And once you got street networks, you can get all kinds of other stuff too. So you can download building footprints or transit stops, points of interest like banks or grocery stores or farmers markets, and elevation data to understand the topography of the city and the street network. Once you have these models, you can analyze them. You can calculate shortest path routes. You can project and visualize different characteristics of the network. And you can calculate automatically a bunch of different geometric and topological indicators of the network. So I separate those two out because one of the weird things with spatial networks is that they're defined by both their geometry and their topology. So they have geometry like angles and lengths and areas, but they also have topology, or a connection and configuration of stuff in space. So real quick before I go in more into this tool I do with it, this is an example of OpenStreetMap. If you're not already familiar with it, it's kind of like Google Maps, but all open source. So like Wikipedia, anyone can contribute to it, and the data can be reused by folks downstream like me. So traditionally in the US, when we wanted to work with street networks, we'd go to the US Census Bureau website, download a Tiger Line roads shapefile, load it up in QGIS, and do some analysis with it. That works okay if you're studying the US, and particularly if you're only studying a few different sites. It doesn't work very well for scalability, for replicability, for being able to constrain your study area to one specific boundary, or to being able to do that many, many times over. And it certainly doesn't work well if you're interested in doing any international studies or looking cross-sectionally across different places where digitization standards vary substantially. Often there are language barriers or even just bureaucratic access barriers to getting this kind of data in a lot of different places. China is one prime example of those data access concerns. In addition to that, even in the US, the Tiger Line road shapefiles didn't have very good information about informal paths or pedestrian infrastructure that would weave through a park or biking infrastructure. So OpenStreetMap built foundationally on those Tiger Line road shapefiles. And then for 10 to 15 years now, there have been additions, improvements, all these new contributions to really flesh out what's on the data set. Because it's a worldwide project, you can do these kind of analyses around the world with some caveats. First, data in cities worldwide tends to be much better than data outside of cities. There are sampling biases there. Second, while driving infrastructure is pretty well represented, so drivable roads worldwide have pretty good coverage, that's not true of other forms of infrastructure. So informal pedestrian paths tend to be very hit or miss. Bicycling infrastructure looks very different even in San Francisco or Des Moines. So you need to be cautious when you're doing these kind of cross-sectional analyses about what you're looking at and where you're looking at it to make sure that the sampling biases aren't the only thing that you're actually looking at cross-sectionally. But overall, OSM data are pretty high quality, and through a series of validation studies, we have a pretty good idea of where they're good and where they're weaker. And for drivable urban infrastructure, they tend to be pretty good. So with OSMNX, we can type a simple command like this to get a graph or network model from place, Los Angeles, California. I specify here that I want the drivable network. And just like that, we get a model of municipal LA's drivable streets, freeways, and everything else. We could just as easily have done LA County, or if I had a shapefile of metropolitan statistical areas, I could have limited to something that more represents the urban area or metropolitan area. We are not limited to the US, so I can just as easily get a network model for Modena, Italy, or the Medina of Tunis, which is an example I always like because you can very clearly see the different urban fabric here between the older, more self-organized complexity of the Medina in the center and toward the left versus the orthogonal grid of the French colonial planners in the 19th century. We can also pull in other stuff. So here I've attached the node elevations to every network node in the city of San Francisco. By default, OSMNX does this automatically for you if you provided a Google Maps elevation API key. You have to pay after a certain amount of use, so you can use other free APIs as well. But elevation data is really useful to model things like street grade or to understand flooding and sea level rise. For example, which community's infrastructure is most prone to being knocked out during different flooding events, given different projections of sea level rise over the coming century. It's also really useful for giving us better impedance functions for non-driving modes of transportation. For example, a motorist may want to merely minimize their travel time from point A to point B, but a cyclist may be willing to bike for an extra minute or two if it means going around a hill rather than straight up over a hill and back down the other side just to shave off a few seconds. So with this elevation data, we're able to create better routing functions like that. Okay, so that's the tool and the background of what it does. I now want to talk about a couple of recent projects I've been working on with it to create street network models and indicators and put them online in open data repositories for other people to use. There are two projects here. One is US specific, and the second one is ongoing, and that is worldwide. So I'll look at them both briefly here. The first one is US specific. So for this project, I modeled the street network of all of the US at different scales. Those scales included every city and town, urban area, county, census tract, and Zillow-defined neighborhood. Now, the first four of those scales are all easily defined through the US Census Bureau. Zillow used to have neighborhood shapefile boundaries online. I believe you need to contact them directly now to get those. But once I had built models for all of those different study sites, I calculated a couple dozen indicators of network form for each. And then I took all those models and indicators and put them in an open data repository online. One of the things that I had looked at with that was this idea of street network form in terms of its orientation entropy. So what that means is I'm curious about to what extent the streets in a place point in the same direction as each other. This is a good spatial signature for central planning. And in particular, we see the spatial signature ubiquitously during certain eras of American planning and in certain kinds of cities. So to talk about that, I want to show you these polar histograms. So in this figure, I have the street networks of Manhattan and Boston, and below each I have a polar histogram. This is like a regular histogram that shows us the relative frequency of stuff. These polar histograms, that histogram of relative frequency just wraps around the face of a compass. And each of the 36 bins in that histogram represent 10 degrees around the face of that compass. Each bar's length tells us the relative frequency of streets that point in that direction. So Manhattan's an easy one to see. The island is offset about 29 degrees from true north. Most of its streets are on an offset north, south, east, west grid. And we can see that pretty clearly in its histogram. Almost all the streets fall into one of 4 bins. Boston, however, looks very different. Boston's street network shows higher orientation entropy. Its streets point more in different directions from each other than the consistent organization of Manhattan's grid. Part of that is just a function of history. Boston slowly incorporated different municipalities and townships over time. Part of it is that it has a couple of different competing grids, like in the Back Bay or South Boston, but they're not aligned with each other. And part of it is just the rural evolution of New England that didn't follow the gridded paradigm that we saw later in other cities or earlier in Spanish model of urbanization in particularly the southern and southwest US. So I can use this idea of entropy to try to understand where streets are aligned with each other. And that's one important component of griddedness alongside the proportion of four-way streets, proportion of four-way intersections, and how straight the streets are. Now, the gridded paradigm was the primary paradigm of American spatial ordering for over a century. Across vast swaths of what were considered a frontier, just to be made legible and spatially organized in a rational utopian framework, the grid was used for rapid railroad expansion, buying land sight unseen for speculation purposes. And we can still see that today with how the US street network looks in 2020. So across the Great Plains and Midwest, all those spatial legacies of the Homestead Act and similar planning tools still written in the urban fabric across both rural and urban areas. Elsewhere, we don't see that as much. Now, there's an archipelago of grids across the cities nationwide because of the era in which most core US cities were built out during the heyday of the gridded paradigm. But typically suburbs and rural areas show less so. We can see some covariates here like elevation, presumably, so mountain ranges make it pretty hard to build out orthogonal grids. If we start looking at these things together over time, we can see some really clear patterns. So what I did is I took all of those census tracts across the country, tagged each of them through 3 different estimation algorithms for what vintage they were first built, and then grouped those tracts by vintage to look at trends across their street networks today. So as you can see here, there are some really similar patterns across a broad basket of indicators. Griddedness declined from World War II through the 1990s, along with that idea of streets being oriented in the same directions as each other. Similarly, straightness declined, four-way intersections declined while dead ends rose, intersection density declined while average street lengths grew. But there's this interesting inflection point about 20 to 25 years ago where these indicators all bottomed out and we start seeing a trend back toward more sustainable forms in American urban design over the past couple of decades. It's preliminary, but it's promising. Unfortunately, we don't build nearly as many census tracts today as we did over the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but it does appear that some amount of American urban planning is reflecting planning theory and urban theory about what kinds of places are more walkable and more easy to provision public transportation on. If you're interested in that recent work, if you have your phone handy, you can scan this QR code or use that URL. Either one will bring you to some of the papers I wrote about that recently. Now, over the past few months, I was motivated from concluding that project to want to expand this more broadly. So now I wanted to look at the rest of the world. So in my current project, I'm modeling the street networks of every urban area in the world. So what I mean by that is that I'm using urban area boundaries from the Global Human Settlements Layer database. That is a consistent set of tools that they have used to try to define what is and isn't urban around the world. With those consistent definitions, I'm using OSMNX to model everything like I talked about in the previous project, calculating those indicators again, and then depositing all of those models and indicators on an open data repository. Now, a little bit more about what I'm doing here. So each urban area in the Global Human Settlements Layer database, that can be a little bit noisy. So I'm looking at only the ones that have been marked true positive by that team in their validation exercises. I'm also only looking at the ones that are at least 1 square kilometer in built up area. I feel like those are pretty lightweight filters for doing this because I wanted to try to make it as comprehensive as possible. But given the noisiness of the source data, it can be a little bit hard to look at everything. So I'm saying that it's every urban area of 1 square kilometer or greater that was a true positive according to that team. I then use OSMNX to download and model the street networks within each of those polygons, create those models, and put all of those code and models in a public repository, which you can get through a link that I'll share at the very end here. But one preliminary step for this modeling process. Once I built those models, I attached elevation to every node, and I calculated all the edge grades. I mentioned earlier OSMNX has built in the ability to use the Google Maps elevation API. That doesn't work as well when you're looking at hundreds of millions of nodes and edges. So what I did instead is I used 3 different data sources. I use Aster and SRTM, which are 2 competing digital elevation models. And then I also used the Google Elevation API. So Google Elevation API was only used as a closed source validation data set to the other 2. So Aster is a 30 meter by 30 meter grid. It has really fine resolution, but it's somewhat noisy. SRTM3 is 90 meters by 90 meters. It's coarser resolution, but it's much less noisy. There's a lot less error there, and it's been further processed to reduce errors and fill voids in the data. But because these are all imperfect data, there are some trade-offs here. So I come up with a set of elevation value selection rules between these data products. So what I do is that by default, I use Aster as the elevation value for each node. If Aster is null, which it often is, I'll fall back onto SRTM3. And for all of them, I compare Aster and SRTM3 to each other. And if they ever differ by more than the SRTM specs error, just something like 16 meters, then I'll use the Google elevation data as the tiebreaker to figure out as kind of a triangulator which one is closer to it. So in the end, I ascribe a single elevation value to each node in all of these models, and then we get edge grades for everything. Once we've done that, we calculate a bunch of different network indicators. So this is stuff that's common in transportation planning, urban design, network science. Things like intersection density, which is perhaps the most ubiquitous indicator of street network form, but also block lengths. So how far it is between intersections, kind of a linear proxy for the block area. I also look at circuity and straightness, so how curvy the road segments are versus how straight they are compared to as the crow flies. Also look at orientation entropy, that indicator I showed you earlier that tells us something about central planning and griddedness. And then lots of other stuff like centralities and clustering and so forth. So a couple quick things to look at here. Coming out of these models, I looked at a sample of 100 of them. And for those 100, I have plotted here those polar histograms that we saw earlier to look at the orientation entropy. I have these sorted from the lowest entropy or most order on the top left, weaving their way down to the highest entropy or most disordered set of street orientations in the bottom right. One of the nice things about giving a talk at University of Chicago is that I can point out to you that Chicago, of the cities I've looked at, has the lowest orientation entropy. It is the most consistently gridded of all of these study sites that I've looked at for big cities. And interestingly, on the bottom right, we have another American city. So Charlotte is the most disordered street network of all of these study sites, similar to places like Sao Paulo, Rome, and other cities that have very different planning history than Charlotte, which is basically just a big suburb of late 20th century spaghetti streets within a single municipal boundary. Now, putting these orientation entropies along with a few other dimensions, there are like 6 different indicators here. And so it's like a 6-dimensional space. I did a big clustering to try to find what kinds of places were alike or dissimilar. This is a T-SNE projection into 2 dimensions The dimensions values here, the units aren't really meaningful in and of themselves based on how that machine learning algorithm works. But the idea here is it shows us the relative clusters in colors and where they fall relative to each other. So we can see in these clusters, we have places like Beijing and Shanghai in a single cluster by themselves. The coarse-grained but fairly grid-like American networks appear in red. Finer-grained gridded networks here in orange. And then places like Buenos Aires and Washington, which comprise sets of offset grids from each other, but are all fairly fine-grained and gridded over the course of the entire city. In other parts of the world, one thing that was interesting was this cluster up here in gray is almost all cities that were built under the auspices of 20th century communism in one form or another, except for Charlotte, which fits in there with those communist cities. Now, once I had created all those models and indicators, I wanted to come up with a better form of counting intersections. So I mentioned earlier that intersection density is perhaps the most ubiquitous measure of street network character. It's a really quick and easy and common way to say how many connections are there in how much space. But there are a couple of problems with how we normally count intersections and then calculate their density. So typically when we're counting intersections, we'll look at a bunch of points and lines in space like this. So here's an intersection, and here's an intersection. But the problem is for things like divided roads or traffic circles, or even just other forms of complex intersections, you'll often get lots of points in space. This is really common in Tiger Line road shapefiles, OpenStreetmap, any streets data set will have this same kind of digitization problem. Now, what I don't want to do is count this really auto-oriented divided road as having particularly high intersection density by counting 3 or 4 points that make up a single intersection as 3 or 4 different intersections. So I came up with a couple of different ways to correct this. The first is really simple and straightforward. We can just buffer those intersections by, say, 15 meters, merge overlapping buffers together, and count those merged overlaps as a single true intersection. It's a nice, quick, and dirty way to do it. But there's a problem. Taking that geometry information into account, but ignoring topology doesn't give us an accurate reflection of where the true intersections are. For example, we might have a freeway interchange above surface streets below it. Just because those things are in 2 dimensions adjacent to each other doesn't mean that they're actually adjacent in the true 3-dimensional transportation network. The same thing goes for blocked off streets that don't actually connect to arterial roads at intersections. We don't want to merge those into a single true intersection. So what I did is I came up with a second algorithm here. There's a similar kind of buffering, but along the network itself. So now we just measure distance, say 15 meters along the network, what can be reached, and then merge those intersections together into one single true whole. And that is what we see here in this figure. So I looked across those different indicators, typical intersection count versus the topological count. And what I found was just counting intersection points in a traditional data set will overcount about 16% on average the true number of topological intersections, the way we think about what an intersection is in urban design. And worst of all, that overcount isn't consistent across parts of the world. So regionally, Australia, New Zealand, and Southern Europe are the worst offenders with a 29% plus overcount. But some countries are particularly bad. So Australia, Spain, and Israel all had a 33% or greater overcount. So why is that? Well, I found bias that has to do with socioeconomic status. So for every 1% increase in urban GDP per capita, you see a 0.25% increase in that overcount. That is, it seems like wealthier places tend to digitize more fine-grained information about their intersections that give you more points per true intersection. That extra data is great, and we can do a lot with it, especially for routing purposes, but it creates a lot of noise in our intersection count. So it's important to use better methods to get more accurate counts and not have these biases across different kinds of places. Now, another thing I've been looking at empirically here with these models is relationships with greenhouse gas emissions. So in particular, I'm interested in what kinds of street network characteristics are associated with more or less CO2 emissions. Now, I want to start off with a simple caveat that this isn't a causal model, and I'm not claiming causality here. There's obviously a lot of endogeneity in these kinds of things. This is just an associative model. But what I've looked at here is total transport sector CO2 emissions from non-short cycle organic fuels. So that means burning old dinosaur bones that have been underground for millions of years. In particular, I'm looking at those total CO2 emissions in a log-log model here with a bunch of different controls and predictors. But the ones that are of interest, to me at least, are these. So even with those controls for nightlight emission and economic status, GDP, the presence of water ports, airports, etc., we still find these significant relationships. So a 1% increase in average node degree is associated with over a 3% decrease in CO2 emissions. So average node degree is a good indicator for connectivity. It's how connected each intersection is to the streets around it. Additionally, a 1% increase in the straightness of the road network is associated with about a 5% decrease in CO2 emissions. And a 1% increase in intersection density, that's the topological intersection density, is associated with a 0.15% decrease in CO2 emissions. And lastly, a 1% increase in per capita street length, or a measure of how much road infrastructure we've built per person who lives in that place, is associated with a 0.45% increase in CO2 emissions. So these associations tell us something about the different road network characteristics, even when controlling for proxies for traffic volume, economic activity, industry, etc. If you're interested in those models or indicators or some of those preliminary empirical findings, if you have your phone handy, you can scan this QR code. The paper that it will take you to has footnotes for all of the code, data, models, everything else that I was just presenting there. So to wrap this up, so we have some time to chat. The purpose of this project was to try to make street network science a little bit more reproducible. So very often when we do street network science, we download a bunch of road geometries from somewhere. We write a bunch of ad hoc code on our own computers, run some analytics, create some tables, write about them, publish them, and then shove everything into a drawer. That's tough because it's hard to reproduce those findings. And in particular with networks, even compared to a lot of other difficult stuff in cities, all of the little modeling decisions that you make have huge impacts on both your findings and the downstream interpretation of your findings. A big push that I'm hoping we can all do as urban scientists is to make these things more transparent. So first off, making our code publicly available so other people can see all of those individual decisions that we made along the way. Second, making our data more available so other people don't have to do all the modeling themselves, but we can just hand it off to people who are less technical, but are steeped in urban theory and really important critical urban questions, but may not have a computer science degree to do all the coding themselves. And then lastly, to make our findings more open source. So not just publishing it behind paywalls, but putting all of this stuff out there for other people to get their hands on and reuse. A part of this effort for me was making OSMNX open source from the very beginning, so that all of the modeling decisions that it makes are transparent and can be improved by the user community. But then also, whenever we write a paper, it's great to have something like a Jupyter notebook or an R notebook that you can submit to a public repository on Git or elsewhere so other people can see exactly what you did and reproduce your findings. So I'm going to leave it at that and open it up for any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Geoff. That was fascinating. So we have a few questions in the chat, and we can start with Luke Joyner. And Luke, feel free to just ask the question yourself. And I know it's in the chat, but that may be easier.
Sure, yeah. Sorry, I'm leaving my video off just because of my connection, but I'm curious if there, at any point in your research, you came across multiple different places where in the sort of examples that you're showing in your quantitative analysis and all your methods, they showed fairly similar situations, but then through other means, whether sort of more qualitative or anecdotal, you realized that they were very different situations, and whether that sort of somehow influenced your analysis in any way, any sort of more qualitative ways of thinking about different places and specific examples?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, one of the pitfalls, you know, that I want to be clear about is that I certainly am not a preacher for design determinism here. You know, that there are different street network characteristics that are really good for being able to walk in a city. It gives you freedom of mode choice, but that doesn't mean that it determines equity or justice or economic strength or anything like that. You know, you can have a street grid on the Upper East Side of Manhattan or on the South Side of Chicago, but those end up being very different kinds of places for historical reasons, for the racism that's endemic in American urban planning over the years. So this is just one part of the puzzle. And in general, for this kind of work, I think mixed methods research is essential. Too often, it's been the urban scientists talking to themselves and the qualitative researchers or critical theorists talking to themselves. And I really hope that we can make tools or data sets that can bridge that divide a little bit better, because there's a lot that each side has to offer to the other.
Great, thanks. Do you have any specific examples you've encountered of just sort of instances where you've been surprised by something that we might not already think about?
Yeah, well, probably. So surprised by what exactly? Like a surprising
Well,
finding, just it wasn't what I thought the form would be like?
yeah, either places where the form sort of showed you something you wouldn't have expected, or places where the form looked similar but actually didn't show you all of the story.
Yeah, so I would say the one thing that most surprised me and ended up, I guess, most surprising people who saw what I wrote about would be how we cognitively think of the city in terms of how big our mental map is of different kinds of places. What I mean by that is that for some of those polar histograms, you might notice a place like Seattle or Minneapolis. Looks like it's primarily on a single orthogonal grid. If you know those places, you know that there's an offset downtown compared to the rest of the city, which was laid out differently. In reality, the rest of the city that was laid out differently totally swamps the offset downtown. But in our minds, we give a lot of prominence to the characteristics of the downtown in the city. It holds, you know, a real prime place in our conception of space. So it looks totally wrong. Even if only 10% of the streets are actually offset in the center of the city, we feel like half the city must be that way because that's where half the economic activity happens. That's where all the tourists go. It's just not what matches our conception of the city. So that was an interesting finding. One thing I'd like to do to follow that up would be to weight these things by other stuff. So it's not just weighted by street length or number of blocks, but weighted by population density or job density or other things about who goes there and when and why.
Great. So Raul has another interesting question about the CO2 emissions correlation that you described. So Raul, do you want to share more about that?
Sure. I was curious if you've looked at how that correlation changed over time. If you look at CO2 emissions in different years. The reason I'm asking that is I'd imagine that like developing countries, as they start to emit more CO2, does that change some of the correlations that you see between, you know, some of these street patterns? And the other kind of follow-up question I wanted to ask was, how does in developing countries, to what extent does the street network there stay static? Whereas, like, you know, you like the same, even as the actual pattern that's like the, you know, the patterns of development, you on those street networks might be changing a lot. And how does that change kind of some of these relationships you've found?
Yeah, for your first question, over time, no, because I don't have that data, but yes, I would love to study that. I think that's a critical question, especially if we can make projections into the future based on that data. That's one of the key questions in urbanization today. For your second question about change over time, especially in developing countries, yeah, absolutely. We don't have longitudinal data though about street patterns. If you're pulling from something like OpenStreetmap, you can pull from 2010, 2015, and 2020, but there's no way to know if the differences between those snapshots are urbanization changes or lagging digitization changes. There's no way to differentiate if someone finally added in data in a small town in India, or if that small town in India just rapidly grew over the past decade. Yeah, and that's a big limitation of this kind of stuff. We're stuck doing primarily cross-sectional work right now because of that problem. I think that'll get better over time, but the first step is to get a complete, comprehensive, or as close as can be, data set with some baseline date. And then we'll have more confidence what those changes over time represent.
What I meant was actually, could you use, I understand that it's hard to get the street level data over time, but could you kind of validate your analysis using emissions data from different periods of time, so that would tell you how much of an impact some of these correlations you're having may be due to like the effects of like developing countries' emissions changing over time?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah, I haven't done that, but I like the idea.
Great. So Grace, there was hi everybody. So there was a question by Michele Massa about some of the elevation data sets. Michele, do you want to jump in? You there? It was one of the earlier questions.
I'm not sure if Michele is, he may not still be on, but we can get back to him for sure.
Okay. He was interested in whether DSM data for elevation, which he thinks has higher resolution. So it's more of a technical question.
What was the alternative? Could you repeat that?
DSM data.
Oh yeah, yeah. I guess I should look into it. I'm not using that now.
Okay. And Isabel Hershey, I think you had a question about tools for policy analysis. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. So I was studying to be a policymaker, specifically in the urban policy setting. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what sort of the implications on policymaking urban spatial analytics has, but then also which of these tools would be particularly useful to me as a policymaker in the future?
Well, I guess for your second question, it really depends on what kind of policy space you're working in and at what level. So, there are different tools for the job at the federal level, state level, local level, or even working as like a community activist or a neighborhood activist. But for that, these tools can be useful for better understanding access, equity, connectivity, the ability to route bus lines through different kinds of places based on how conducive the urban form is, better understanding the social injustice of building freeways through certain kinds of neighborhoods in the past and how we can remediate that today. But how you use the tool or what you would use it for would really be a function, I guess, of your own interest and passion in life, like what battle you want to fight. And sorry, the first half of your question again?
The implications of your tools on policymaking.
Yeah, okay, so I guess that was kind of related. Similar answer for that too. One of the funny things with tool building is you don't always know where your children end up in the world, but occasionally I either see it, like looking through someone's GitHub repo or someone tells me. So I know there are a few city planning agencies that use these tools, and some different research institutes will use them as well for network modeling. I know Remix Transit early on had built their transportation planning platform with OSMNX to do their baseline models of the street network.
Great. So Spencer Netherwood had also a question about, relates to policy. Spencer, do you want to jump in? I don't understand actually the specificity of your question.
Oh yeah. I figured I would just raise my hand and then explain in verbally. But yeah, thanks for speaking, Geoff. I appreciate the shout out for the non-technical people at the end of your talk. Because I'm a second year in the policy school, so I definitely like this from a sort of personal passion aspect, and sort of like trying to bring that sort of voice into you know, non-academic groups that don't necessarily sort of realize yet the value of some of this. And I was intrigued by so even an example of that, you had that data point where, you know, Charlotte and the communist bloc countries had physical street network similarities. And I feel like from a policy perspective, you know, that's great because that's like a really evocative way to get across, you know, some of the needs to sort of move away from some of these detrimental street networks. And sort of that data makes that storytelling process easier. I'll be interested if you were able to like kind of fill in the color of what actually are some of these similarities between, you know, Charlotte and say the street networks of the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, well, if you walk around Charlotte or if you walk around Moscow, they look extremely different from each other. The main thing that we're capturing there is the coarse grain of the planning. So kind of super blocks, curving streets, and disconnectivity. Both were either built or rebuilt in the 20th century under fairly strong central planning with different spatial logics and political contexts, but it ended up producing this interesting form across like 6 different dimensions. And yeah, I like your point too. You know, if we can appeal to North Carolina to make America great again, perhaps we can appeal to their patriotism about being more like other American cities with more fine-grained or walkable street networks than 20th century communist planned cities have. But part of it is also, you know, confusing causation with correlation as well. So there are correlations here that these things look like something else, but for different reasons and with some different impacts.
Great, thank you.
Great. Emily Talon, do you want to jump in? Good to see you, Emily.
Sure. Hey, Geoff. Thank you
Emily.
so much. Fantastic talk. It was great to see your work summarized. So yeah, I was just thinking about I love it when you draw connections between street patterns and social and economic variables in particular. And you know, I was thinking about the political environment right now and how much we hear about rural voters versus suburban voters versus urban voters. What is your understanding of nuancing that a little better and relating that political persuasion to something as detailed as street networking? Has that ever been done?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of that is far beyond my pay grade. One thing that I think is interesting, though, is your comment about more nuanced definitions for these terms. I think suburban is often used you know, disparagingly by people who prefer different urban forms. I think urban is often used disparagingly by people who are afraid of the things that entails, either you know, race or disorder or economic conditions or anything else. But you know, suburbs are cities. It's just a different kind of thing, and it's a gradient, right? There's not a binary between the two, and there's a gradient out to the rural as well. The main thing for me, I think, with street networks in these different kinds of contexts is about access. And access works very differently in each of these different places. And too often there's a centrally planned solution that doesn't work well for local community interests or remediation of the redress of past harms. So I don't know, I guess for street network planning, some mix of local planning and more nuance and where we're thinking about these gradients would be very useful. These indicators are a nice way to do it, you know, rather than just saying, here's where one municipality ends and another one begins. We can look at the built form to see those changes more gradually happening over different spatial scales.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, and I want everyone to know also that Geoff has done wonderful work on many things, but one that is particularly interesting is on rental markets and also ways to understand sort of the housing part of the street network. So not just the emphasis on the street networks, but sort of buildings and housing and dynamics of that. We have a few minutes. I was wondering if you could say a few words about what that work is and what questions you're asking, Geoff.
Yeah, so I've been recently interested in the nature of how rental housing markets are changing through new information technologies. So traditionally, we would circulate information and exchange knowledge about housing availability and so supply and demand through newspaper listings or for rent signs or more through social networks. Today, the vast majority of that activity has moved online to sites like Craigslist, Zillow, Rent Jungle, etc. And there's this hope that as that moves online, we'll have this democratization of information where everybody can go to those websites, anybody can post on those websites. So we'll see less of that traditional racialized steering and sorting that happened in rental housing markets over the past decades, centuries. So I've been looking at a lot of rental listings and trying to understand these different information channels. And what I found is that rather than that sort of techno-utopian view of maybe this will finally make things better, it's instead amplifying a lot of the current historical trends that we've been seeing currently. So different kinds of people self-segregate into different information exchanges. The information that they share in them gives them information about the kinds of neighborhoods they live in, but not about other kinds of neighborhoods that are different from their own. And these processes reproduce a lot of the historical information inequalities and a lot of the things that shape how we sort ourselves into different communities. And technology appears to be making it worse, not better.
Right. So, so let's think about there also. We were discussing how the several technological transitions that we're in the middle of, including information, to do with information, but also future upcoming to do with sustainability, and presumably at some point, a lot of investment in and energy and so forth, how these transitions may actually be better for the public interest in various communities. But it does take people like us bring sort of a perspective of what are these transformations and how could they be unrolled in a different way that doesn't exacerbate problems that are already there. So I think we're about on time, Geoff. So I'm just going to thank you again. It's been wonderful to see you again. In general, see that you're doing so well in Southern California, and thank you for your wonderful work. And we hope to stay in touch and continue to exchange ideas. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Geoff.
Great being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.